So the 2025 Canadian federal election has come to an end. And I think looking back on it, it's fair to say that it was one of the most chaotic and off-the-rails elections that at least I have certainly seen in my lifetime. Now, of course, the American election last year was insane as well, but the Canadian election, in terms of the whiplash, the back and forth, and the utter insanity of what was going on, it's actually kind of hard to believe that it panned out the way that it did. For those of you that don't know, the governing Canadian Liberal Party was in a very dire strait towards the end of 2024. They had been in power for just under 10 years, and to say they were unpopular and that Trudeau, their leader, was unpopular would be the understatement of the century. And I don't just mean that things were bad, I mean they were facing electoral oblivion under Justin Trudeau last year. It was looking like they would be in the range of a minor party in terms of the seats that they were going to win in the House of Commons. And a big part of this situation, aside from the party's missteps and their declining popularity with the broader Canadian public, was the fact that the Conservatives in Canada were really at their A game leading up to this election, or at least back then it looked like they were. The leader of the Canadian Conservatives, Pierre Poilievre, regardless of what you think of him or his policies, he did something very, very well, and that was uniting Conservatives and conservative-minded people under one banner, one big, broad church for this election. Not only did Pierre completely destroy a far-right breakaway Conservative party, but he also made an appealing pitch to somewhat centrist, maybe slightly conservative voters that would normally vote Liberal, but couldn't stand Trudeau and the last 10 years of Canadian politics, so just decided to give Pierre a chance. So this broad church was being held together by one man, and it looked like they were on track for an incredible victory. And everybody assumed that that was the way that things would play out. It was a clean sweep being set up for the Conservative Party. They were going to knock this out of the park, and then Justin Trudeau vanished. Politically, that is. He didn't disappear. He just left politics. And that had been brewing for a while, but it became apparent that the Liberals really needed somebody else, and his party started pushing him to step aside. Not with the hopes of maybe winning the election, but that any face other than Trudeau's might save some seats, and that the election defeat wouldn't be as bad as it possibly could be if Trudeau stayed on. What was interesting was that nobody really expected the person that took over to be a good candidate. But what ended up happening is that the best possible individual showed up to save the Liberal Party in its dying moments. Mark Carney was not a member of Parliament when this election kicked off. He had never been. Mark Carney was a banker who had previously worked for the Canadian Conservative government back in 2008 and helped manage during the global financial crisis. In fact, he did such a good job that he ended up becoming the governor of the Bank of England after his tenure in Canada. He was a man who had no established ties whatsoever to the Liberal Party of Canada, but that was actually an enormous strength for him because he was not at all connected to the unpopular government that Trudeau had been running for the last 10 years. So Carney was essentially a miracle candidate for the Liberals, somebody who had no association with the unpopular Liberal government and somebody who had a lot of economic credentials and had even worked with the Conservative Party of Canada to get things back on track back in 2008. This was the point where things really started to get interesting because it became abundantly clear that there was a massive flaw in the Conservative Party's strategy that had given it so much success up until this point. And that was that there was a reliance on Justin Trudeau being the enemy. But it didn't work as well when he was gone. Justin Trudeau had alienated a lot of people, especially left-wing people. And other left-wing parties, particularly like the Greens in Canada and the New Democratic Party, which is a large party in Canada, which is to the left of the Liberals, were doing particularly well at the expense of the Liberals. And a lot of people that were going to those other left-wing options slowly started coming back as Trudeau was no longer a factor. And that's when you begin to see the Conservatives think, oh, maybe there's a point of diminishing returns on how much we're appealing to all Conservatives. Because Pierre Poilievre, in making his Grand Conservative coalition, did court and play a little bit with that more Trump-style fringe of conservatism. And as a Canadian politician, that is not something you want to be associated with at all when the President of the United States starts joking constantly about annexing Canada. This is where things in the Canadian election really hit fifth gear, because not only at this point do we have one of the most successful and large conservative campaigns ever, which is genuinely impressive. We're talking about the Canadian Conservative Party getting upwards of 40% of the vote, which by Canadian standards is incredible. You suddenly have an enormous left-wing unity movement responding to it. We pretty much immediately saw the Green Party and the New Democratic Party, Canada's other left-wing options, completely collapse in the polling, and the Liberal Party surge like I've never seen in an election ever. What we basically witnessed was Canada's 3 and a bit party system utterly collapse in on itself, and an election that is pretty much just a 2-horse race. So this election basically became the entirety of Canada's conservative voter base uniting behind one candidate and polling higher than they have in upwards of a decade. And then on the other side was basically this weird union of as many left-wing Canadians as possible hoping to rebuke Poilievre and his association with this new type of pro-Trump conservatism. So what were the results of this enormous clash between the largest Liberal and the largest Conservative campaigns in history? Well, by my eye, it was pretty close. So the first thing you'll notice is that the New Democratic Party completely collapsed as its base went en masse to the Liberals to help them fight the Conservatives. And the Conservatives did not do bad. They massively outperformed their result at the last election, but so did the Liberals. So Parliament looks like this. It is almost entirely composed of Liberals and Conservatives, with a few Quebec nationalists and a sliver of Greens and NDP put in there. So the Liberal Party forms government, but the Conservatives did do very well for themselves. Like I said, they got more than 40% of the vote. That is an incredible high for them. They got, I believe, 20 more seats than before the election, but this does mark the fourth election in a row that the Conservatives have now lost to the Liberals. But there's something really interesting about the results, and this is not something that I noticed until I was actually looking at the map on election night, and that is the fact that Pierre Poilievre and Mark Carney, the Prime Minister and the opposition leader, going head-to-head, the ridings that they're running in, the seats, the constituencies that they are trying to represent, their electoral districts are right next to each other. These two are literally neighbours. And I think it was made very clear that that corner of Canada that they are both living in very much prefers Mark Carney, because Carney won in his riding with a pretty solid majority, and he's in a very safe Liberal seat. But Pierre Poilievre, who has been representing his chunk of that little corner of Canada for 20 years now, didn't win in his own seat. Despite the fact that his party outperformed a lot of expectations, did incredibly well by its own standards, the leader didn't even win in his own seat. I want you to take a look at this photo to give you a sense of how hectic and how rapidly things get shaken up. These are back in 2024, that is, were the 3 leaders of the major parties. You had Justin Trudeau there, Prime Minister, leader of the Liberal Party, Pierre Poilievre, leader of the Conservatives, and then Jagmeet Singh, leader of the New Democratic Party. Back in 2024, they're party leaders. Now, none of them are in Parliament. Canadian politics has always fascinated me because of how rapidly things can shake up and how drastic the changes can be. And I think this really exemplifies it, is that if you're if you are the 3 most powerful men in the Canadian political realm, be sure you don't take it for granted, because in 5 months' time, all 3 of you could be out of a job.